18. Rain drummed on the awnings overhead and dripped down between the gaps onto the stone paving of the kitchen courtyard. Karun was exhausted, and so were the rest of his wing. Karun felt as if he could scarcely hold his head up. They sat around their customary table, staring at their dinner, so tired they could hardly eat. They weren't the only ones. The senior jousters were just as exhausted, if not more so. And there wasn't a man without some sort of minor injury among them: bruises, wrenched muscles, sprains. The main difference, really, was that the senior jousters had been flying missions, and the boys had only been practicing. Heclatus was going from table to table, peering into eyes here, demanding to see throats there, and pouring an occasional dose from a steaming jug he carried, demanding it be drunk down on the spot. No one really minded. Heclatus's potions were always drinkable, and sometimes they were even tasty. He had more than made himself useful here. He had made himself indispensable. This was just as well for someone who was trying to keep the Magi from discovering he, too, was a magus. Should anyone come looking for a magus hereabouts, he would have the entire compound swearing he was so good a healer he could not possibly have any time for anything else. Practice had been difficult as usual. The desert dragons had protested every moment they had to spend in the rain, and Karun couldn't blame them one bit. They weren't meant for this muck, and if it hadn't been for Calith's premonitions, he wouldn't have forced them out into the weather at all. The rains had always been a time for rest and recovery for the jousters of Tia, and it would have been nice if it could have been the same for the jousters of Alta. Each of the tame dragons had reacted differently to the rain. Apetma sulked and had temper tantrums. Say Atman was lethargic, as if she could not muster any energy. Re-Ethka was nervous and made mistakes. Caliph was clumsy. Perhaps he was affected more by the cold. Bethlin slept and slept and slept when she wasn't practicing or eating. Dioth whined the entire time he was in the air. Wastet growled at everyone except Orist, and Tethulan just gazed at everyone with the saddest eyes. As for poor Avatra, she hung her head with depression that didn't ease until she was back in her sand wallow. He hated asking this of them, but he felt as if he had no choice. The Magi were watching them all, he knew it, he felt it, and Heclatus confirmed it. If they didn't put on a good show of doing their best to get themselves into combat-ready shape, it wouldn't be long before the veiled accusations started. And then, perhaps, the open ones. They had been Torith's friends, and Calith lived among them. It would be so easy to point the finger of accusation at them all. Calith's premonitions were coming more often now. Actually, they looked more like fits when it came down to it. The boy would sit bolt upright in that peculiarly rigid pose, stare into something only he could see, his mouth would open, and that hollow voice would say things. Karun just considered that they were lucky that Calith's pronouncements were clear and unambiguous. According to Akhet 10, most of the current practitioners of the Seer's Eye among the Winged Ones were so cryptic that they required interpreters. The Magi were watching them all, according to Calith, as well as Heclatus, and would take any pretext to accuse Torith's friends of treason. The warnings had been timely, coming right after the start of the rains. It wasn't just the 10 of them, of course. Merritt later confirmed that any of Torith's friends inside or outside the compound were under intense scrutiny. For that matter, it wasn't only Torith's friends and acquaintances. Outside of that circle, it seemed there were rumors of people being hauled off and imprisoned every other day on suspicion of disloyalty. Tempers were always a little raw during the rains, but this year nerves were being stretched to the breaking point. The word treason was being made to apply to anything that the Magi didn't like. Traitors were those who dared to differ with anything that they wanted. Nevertheless, the boys were determined to give the Magi no excuse to voice their suspicions. So while the senior jousters went out to fight, Karun's wing went out to practice, making a show of using even the most miserable weather to train, even if they wouldn't be expected to go fight for another 2 seasons at best. Karun could only remind himself, as he saw the misery in Avatra's eyes, that if she had been in the wild, she would have had to hunt for her food every day regardless of the conditions. The best he could do for her and the others was to make certain that though they did get wet, they never got chilled, and they were always fed the best that the compound had to offer. That, and a great deal of love and attention, was all he could do to try and make up for her daily struggle in the wet. There wasn't much he could do for the boys other than commandeer the empty pen of one of the swamp dragons, one whose rider had been lost in combat before the rains, and who had not returned, for daily hot soaks for everyone. The cooks had taken the universal exhaustion of everyone with a dragon into consideration, and were providing meals that were comforting to the spirit and warming to the body. Tonight, dinner was meat and lentil soup, thick, hot, and filling, and most of all, extremely tasty, soothing to the stomach, and not requiring much chewing. A consideration when several of the jousters had facial bruises, either from flying accidents or being cracked across the jaw by missiles from below. Curran tasted his, judged it cool enough to eat, and spooned some up. It was wonderful, and so flavorful it actually woke up his appetite, and he ate it slowly, with bread so fresh it steamed when he broke it open, and so soft it almost melted in his mouth. Everyone else was eating the same way, heads propped on one hand, leaning over the table, so weary they were half asleep and prodded on only by their hunger. If the Magi were spying on them now by what Heraclitus called scrying, they were having a singularly dull time of it, for all that they were seeing was tables full of warriors weary from fulfilling their duty. Because the senior jousters weren't using the practice field, and no one was going to play spectator in the rain, at last Curran's wing was able to practice right at the compound. And because they were having to fly slowly anyway, the missile weapons were useless. They were practicing real jousting. Curran didn't expect them to ever have to use the skill, but it was better to have it than not, and the spies would take it amiss if they weren't trying to learn it. There was a new modification to the harnesses. Curran had mandated it for the boys first, but now even the senior jousters had asked for the additions. "We can't afford pride," one of them had growled. "There are too few of us." So now everyone had harness straps holding them to their saddles. The straps could be broken, oh yes, and if a jouster was hit hard enough to break the straps, he would certainly fall to his death, but it took a lot more to kill an Altan jouster now, at least. So there were bruises and strains among them, as well as the jousters, compounded with their simple exhaustion. Orist even had a spectacularly black eye. Only one person looked alert, for Caliph ate with them now instead of by himself. He had decided to do this on his own. It had taken him something of an effort, and Curran was very proud of him for taking that step. Normally he was as silent as the rest of them during a meal, but tonight, after a cautious glance to see that no one was within easy listening range, he leaned over and whispered, "I have to talk to you all after dinner." Curran groaned inwardly. Orist, who was clearly in some pain, groaned openly. "Can't it wait?" he asked plaintively. "No. Come to Heraclitus's quarters," Caliph said shortly, looking around again, and went back to his meal as if he had said nothing at all. But that certainly got their attention. Heraclitus's quarters were securely guarded against every sort of magical spying that the healer knew of. They had only gone there once or twice when they wanted to be sure that nothing they said could be overheard. The first time had been when he and Akhet 10 reported the successful release of the dust. The second, when Heraclitus wanted them to hear that the Temple of the Twins was now tended only by servants, the winged ones being in their quarters from the time the Magi brought them back from the tower until the time the Magi came for them again in the morning. Now Heraclitus had certainly lived up to the reputation of Akkadians as being as clever as 5 cats and as slippery as a serpent, because he had managed to arrange things so that even if a magus discovered all of the protections on his quarters, himself, and the boys, he had a perfectly logical explanation that would hold up to the closest scrutiny. All of the shields and wards, as he called them, had been cast on the images of his gods in his quarters, images that had indisputably come with him from Akkad. He could protest in all innocence that he had no idea there was any magic on them, but that they had been blessed by the priests of his nation. And as for the protections on himself, the boys, and Akhet 10, well, those were all centered in Akkadian amulets, which he could claim had also come with him and been similarly blessed, and to prove it, he still had a chest full of similar amulets, all of which had gotten the same blessing. It was unlikely in the extreme that anyone would even guess that he and Karun had spent the better part of 2 days making a mold of his amulet, casting dozens of copies, firing them, and stringing them on cords, nor that it had been Heklatis, not some priest, who had put the spells on them. How supremely ironic it had been that Karun had used the skills he had picked up in the service of Kefti the Fat. As for why Heklatis would have bestowed those amulets on the boys, the reason was simple. He and they would claim truthfully that they had asked for them, seeing the image of a winged solar disk on them, so like the same symbol of the Altan sun god. Clever, clever Akkadian. How would they have managed without him? He would have liked to ask Caliph about 100 questions, but Caliph downed the last of his soup, drinking it straight from the bowl, and left the table. The rest of them exchanged glances after he left that varied from resignation to astonishment. Whatever was going on, it was Caliph, above all of them, who had the most to lose, and knew how careful they must be. He would not have told them to do this unless there was a very, very good reason. So how to come up with a good excuse for the whole lot of them to descend on Heklatis? It seems as if I spend half my life now trying to come up with innocent reasons to do something in case someone is watching, he thought wearily. I am very tired of this. He couldn't help but wonder now. If he had known that this was what his life would come to, would he have returned to Alta at all? Finally, Karun spoke aloud. You all look like trampled barley, he said, and I feel like trampled barley. Finish your dinner, and as wing leader, I am ordering the entire wing to visit the healer. I want him to look us over carefully, one and all. Potions at dinner are all very well, but I think we ought to get the healer to check us completely. The last thing I want is for one or more of us to fall ill. A mistake in the air can be fatal. Well, said Gan after a moment, since he mixed the last potion he gave me with distilled palm wine, I'm not going to object too strongly. I'm tired, but too nervy to sleep anyway. Maybe he can give me something to make me relax and drop off. The rest nodded. I want something for this eye, Orist said ruefully because the eye was his own fault. He had actually smacked himself with the jousting lance. Karun didn't hurry them as they finished their meal. That would have looked odd, and the last thing he wanted was for anything to look odd at the moment. Besides, no matter how urgent Caliph thought the situation was, he was in no great hurry to hear it. Only when they were all through, Akhet 10 included, did he nod and climb stiffly over the bench to lead them to Heklatis' rooms. They were able to walk under awnings most of the way, and only had to dash under the young waterfall pouring down over the awning at the break where the corridor met the entrance to the courtyard. By now it was dark, but the door of the main room was open and warm lantern light shone invitingly out at them. The room was as inviting as the light had promised, and their host had laid out cushions and stools for all of them. Caliph was already there, waiting for them and looking as tense as a strung harp, and so was Heklatis, of course. Once they were all inside, Heklatis shut the door after them, and made a peculiar, twisting little gesture on the surface of it. Caliph relaxed at once. Now we can talk, he said with gratitude. Karun, I have to leave. Karun was more than a little startled. That was not what he had expected to hear. All right, he said cautiously. So, it's not what you think. Caliph interrupted. It's not that the Magi are coming for me yet, and it's not that I don't feel as if I belong among you, because I do. What is it then? Orist asked. I had a vision today while you were all at afternoon practice, he said. Heklatis was with me, And what made it different was that this one I remembered afterward. His expression took on a little of that faraway look it got when he was actually having a vision. I spoke with one of the Bedu, the blue people, and he said, I think it was a he, said you would remember him. He said he was the one who guided you to the edge of the Delta marshes from the last oasis, and told you that you had to stop being Vetch and start being Kurun. Kurun blinked. He might have been skeptical about this vision, except that right there was the proof that it was a true one. There was no way that Caliph could have known what that final mouth of the Bedu had said to him about leaving his serf self behind, because he had never told anyone. All right, he repeated. So what else did you see? It wasn't so much what I saw as what I was shown, Caliph said, and now he looked at them each in turn, his expression sober and a little frightened. I have to leave and meet with this Bedu. He's going to help me find a place where we can make a refuge, a secure hiding place, a sanctuary. He, the Bedu, said, and my vision showed me, that we're going to need it. He said he and the other Bedu like him had been having the same vision as me, and he had been appointed to vision speak me to make me understand, because I hadn't been trained, and otherwise I might not understand how important it was that I do this. A refuge? Gan said skeptically. For who? You, at least at first, Caliph replied. Because once the Jousters are no more because the Tala fails and the dragons all escape, the Magi won't let you 9 live. Even though Kurun had more than half expected to hear something like this someday, it came as a jolt. He felt cold all over, and it wasn't because of the rain, winds, and chill. It was an ugly thing to hear that someone intended your death. Kurun turned his gaze on Akhet 10. You're in that 9. You need to understand that. I already did, Akhet 10 said bitterly. Kurun suspected that he wasn't the only person to feel as if a line of ice-laced fire ran down his spine at that moment. But he believed Caliph. Oh my, yes. He had seen what the Magi could and would do to those they considered threats, and the last remaining Jousters in Alta would be a threat to their continued aggrandizement of power, if nothing else. Me, too, of course. Well, I'll already be there. And after us, others will come, Caliph continued. Mostly from Alta, though not all. You too, Herclatus. I suspected as much, the healer said dryly. For one thing, I'm rather too closely linked with a lot of you. For another, if there are no Jousters, they won't need a healer now, will they? But the thing is, I have to meet with the Bedu and pay them to help me in the desert and find the place. They don't even know it exists. The one who spoke to me said that the Bedu think it's only a legend. He looked triumphant. It's Te Patenka, the lost city, and my visions are going to lead me to it. That held them frozen in their seats for a moment. Everyone knew about the lost city, how it had been buried by a mammoth sandstorm in a single night. It had supposedly incurred the anger of the god Horus, because the inhabitants had turned into brigands, preying on their neighbors, and after they cast out their own priests for warning them, he had raised his hand against them. But no one had ever seen it, not even the Bedu whose home the desert was. I should say, Caliph continued, that I'll pay them for passage, and then when I find the city, I know where to find a store of gold to pay them to help me set it up for you. The Bedu with the visions trust me, of course, but they're poor. Exactly, Kurun put in, as the others began to look a bit skeptical at all this talk of payment. The desert takes everything you have just to survive. The Bedu have nothing to spare to sustain an outsider. They need payment in order to get extra supplies for you. He nodded. And then They'll need more gold to get the supplies to help me make the place livable for the rest of us." He looked a little feverish, but had an air of triumph about him, and had a look as if he had at last found meaning for his life and a great goal to pursue. Well, if that was the case, Kurun couldn't blame him for looking triumphant. In many ways, he had emerged from Torith's shadow and come into his own kingdom. "So, if you're going to be wandering out in the desert, just how are we supposed to find you in this refuge?" Ossetra asked, with a touch of irony. "I don't fancy flying off across the wastelands trying to find a place that shouldn't exist." "You won't have to. The Bedu will find you and bring you to me when the time comes. The mouth will know when and where to find you. That's all I know." He shrugged. "The visions showed me the city, but not how you'll end up there, though I think it's bound to be when the dragons go wild. And it's getting dangerous for me to be here. I'm not sure why. I only know that it is. The Bedu said so too. I'll leave in the morning. So this is the last time we'll all meet before I see you in Te Patenka." Kurun cast a glance over at Heklatus, who interpreted the look correctly. "I believe him, Kurun," the healer said. "I think this is a true vision. I told you once that these things come in fragments. We should be glad that he got enough to know the next part of the plan." "We essentially destroy the Jousters, then escape into a refuge," Kurun mused aloud. "It could be worse, I suppose." Caliph scowled at him. "Yes, it could," he said with annoyance verging on anger. "You could come back to the compound after the battle, and the Magi could wipe you all out of the sky with the eye. I've seen that, too, and I don't want to see it truly happen instead of being a maybe future." That stopped Kurun dead. In fact, they all went as still as stone for a moment, and in the silence, the rain outside was very loud indeed. "All right," Kurun said into the silence. "In that case, let's all work on making sure that particular maybe future never has a chance of coming true." Kurun half expected that no one outside of their little group and Merit and her sister Nofret would even notice that Caliph was gone, and as far as he was able to tell, that was the case. Lord Kaman did not mention it. There were no rumors from the court, and in fact, Caliph's absence might well even be a relief for some. Kurun did not even attempt to keep up the fiction that he was still there, though if anyone asked him, he was going to say, truthfully, that Caliph had left one night, leaving no word of where he was going, and then add, "Though he spoke once of trying to find the lost city." He figured that such a statement would brand Caliph as completely mad. Even the Magi would probably not bother to look for him after that. But no one outside the group ever spoke of him. Perhaps, like Torith, they were all trying to pretend he had never existed. Perhaps they were trying not to draw attention to themselves. Perhaps both. But within a half moon, and deep into the rains, they all got a rude shock, and Kurun was very, very glad that Caliph had gone. It went down as one of the black moments of his life. Lord Kaman sent dragon boys around to the entire compound that morning as they all awakened, saying that he wished to address them over breakfast. Kurun fed Avatra without thinking very much about it, though it wasn't unusual for Lord Kaman to address them all together. It wasn't unheard of. Perhaps the work of the Rains had gotten noticed, and the Great Ones wanted to send a reward of some sort, or at least a word of commendation. They certainly deserve it, he thought, with more than a bit of bitterness. More than the Magi, if you were to ask me. After all, they were having to fly in that magic-befouled weather, and because of their efforts, the border had been pressed back yet again, almost to the place it had been when Kurun's own village had been lost to the Tians so many years ago. But when Lord Kaman finally appeared to the restless crowd of jousters waiting for him in the kitchen courtyard, he was not alone. There was a magus with him, and at the sight of the man, the muttering men in the courtyard went deathly quiet. It seemed at that moment that every drop of rain on the awnings overhead and dripping down between the gaps in the cloth was terribly, terribly loud. Akhet-Ten sucked in a breath, and Karun was very glad that she was sitting at the back of them all, and they were at a table at the back of the wall. There were a lot of taller, older men between them and the Magus, and yet the man's penetrating eyes seemed to sweep the crowd and see all of them. Karun would very much rather have been in complete shadow at that moment, and he hoped that the Magus had only seen a sort of shape, and not that there was a girl among them. He did not want Akhet-Ten to be noticed. It was not a comfortable sensation. Those eyes were as cold and as dead as opaque pebbles, and Karun would have wagered at that moment that he was looking at a man who would bury his own mother alive if it got him something he wanted. But at least his gaze didn't rest on any of them. "This is Magus Mut-Kara," said Lord Kaman carefully, too carefully, into the silence. "The Great Ones have decreed that he is to have oversight of the Jousters, in order that the Magi may make the best use of us. Our tactics, so successful now, they say, will become even more successful with a Magus to guide us." There were worlds of hidden meaning there, and Karun was under no illusion that he could read more than half of them. It would have taken someone like Toreth or Calith, versed in double-dealing of the court, to decipher all of them. Some were clear enough, though. Lord Kaman was under no illusion that the Magus was here to help the Jousters. "The man is here to spy on us, he means," Karun thought instantly, and was passionately grateful that now there was nothing to hide. No dust, no plan to spread it, and no Calith with his visions. What would the Magi have done had they discovered Toreth's brother had become a winged one, untrained, and one of the sort they dreaded most? At least he could have expected to be dragged off to the Tower of Wisdom to be used and used up. At the worst, Karun preferred not to think about what the worst could be. He had the horrible suspicion he couldn't possibly imagine it. No wonder Calith had said that he was in danger. If he'd had any hint from his visions that this was coming, he could only have read it as imperative that he get away. And how fortunate it was that they had already found ways of explaining everything else that the Magi might take exception to. Everyone had the stories straight, and no one would deviate from them or fumble out contradictory explanations. The Magus nodded at Lord Kaman's words, but said nothing. He only looked at all of them, hunting with his eyes, searching for some sign of rebellion, perhaps. Karun set his chin, straightened his back, and looked right back again. He would not show this man that he was afraid. If he saw anything, let him see defiance and be damned to him. Let him see rebellion, if that was what he was looking for. He could suspect it all he wanted. Karun's actions would not give him any ammunition for an accusation. "The Magus's words are to be obeyed as mine," Lord Kaman said tonelessly, making it very clear in that moment just who was the new ruler here, if the Magus's attitude hadn't already made that clear. It was not an auspicious beginning for the day. By the time the day was over, it was quite clear that there was no love lost between the Magus and his new charges. Karun was not the only jouster to meet the appearances of the Magus with outward but bare civility. Mut-Kara poked his long nose into everything, from the kitchen to the sandbath pen, and asked abrupt questions wherever he went. The dragons didn't like him, and greeted his appearance with hisses and whines. Even the best-tempered of them made no bones about their dislike of him. He repaid their displays with no visible expression whatsoever. The jousters ignored him, except when he addressed one of them directly, and they gave him as little opportunity to do that as possible. They kept out of his way until time to fly, then quickly took their dragons to the landing courtyard, knowing he would not venture out into the rain, then mounted as fast as they could and got their dragons into the air. The dragons didn't even care to linger. That left him only Karun's wing to inspect. He surprised Karun by appearing soundlessly in the door to Avatra's pen, appearing out of the gloom while Karun was harnessing her. The first Karun knew he was there was when he cleared his throat ostentatiously. Karun might have jumped, but Avatra covered it by swinging her head toward the doorway, eyes wide. "Well," the Magus said in an arrogant tone of voice, "so this is the famous Tian Jouster boy and his dragon." There were many replies that Karun could have made to that, and most of them would have been rude. He bit his tongue as Avatra stuck out her neck and hissed at him, and confined himself to simply saying, "I am still in training, and I was not aware that I was famous, my lord." The Magus grunted. Karun remained silent, continuing his work, moving slowly and carefully to keep from fumbling anything out of nervousness. Avatra showed her teeth. "Isn't she big enough to fly to combat?" the Magus said, with growing irritation when his continuing silence could not prod anything more out of Karun. "She is not fully trained, my lord, and neither am I," he replied, deciding that it was more than worth the irritation it would cause the Magus to hear the same answers repeated and rephrased over and over. "And we are both much younger than even the traditionally trained jousters and their dragons. Size is no indication of age or skill, my lord, nor of readiness, much less of trained competence." This time the reply was a snort. "So, what is it that you claim? That you are inept?" "That I am untrained in traditional jousting, my lord," Karun said, keeping his tone even. "Avatra is a desert dragon, my lord, and they grow to be much larger than those you're used to seeing. She is no older than 3 years. The youngest of your fighting dragons is 3 times that age, and I have been training for little more than 1 year. The least training that your jousters receive before they take to the battlefield is 2 years. He couldn't help it. His voice took on an edge of anger, though he did his best to control it. "Are you suggesting, my lord, that I should attempt things that are beyond my skill and hers? That we should risk not only ourselves, but the lives of those who would wrongly depend on us, thinking we are skilled and practiced jousters? That we should engage in the monumental hubris of believing we are ready for things we have no business trying, merely because we are, if indeed we are, famous? That, my lord, would not only be foolhardy, it would border on treason, wouldn't you say? To knowingly go into battle, aware that we cannot do what is asked of us when there are others depending on us to do what we cannot? Are you suggesting that this would be a good idea?" There, he had flung the challenge back in the Magus's face, and now he looked up to see a most peculiar expression there. Surprise, and perhaps a touch of fear? So, even the Magi are not immune to accusations of treason. It was something unexpected, and something he decided to think about later. And they're not used to having their weapons used against them. That was something else to think about. It suggested a number of ways of dealing with this man. "Your pardon, my lord, but you are standing in our path, and I should not like Avatra to strike at you," he said with poisonous politeness. "I would do my best to prevent it, of course, but that may not be entirely possible, when it is clear that she has taken an intense dislike to you. And if we are to take up our duty, every moment of training, even in these conditions, which she, as a desert dragon, is particularly unsuited to, is precious." Avatra punctuated his words with a hiss and snap in the Magus's direction. The man actually stepped back a pace. "In fact, my lord," Karun pointed out, unable to resist being able to do so, "these dragons are performing far and away above what their Tian relatives can do. The other desert dragons that we have, the ones that are not tame, are remaining in the pens and cannot be persuaded into the sky by any means during the rains. Nor can the Tian dragons. But our dragons will work for us, even under conditions that they hate. No one sane could ask more than that." The Magus stepped back another 2 paces, as Karun led Avatra forward 1. A third backward step took him into the corridor, as he clearly searched for something to say, and just as clearly came from his search with no good results. "I suggest that you get on with it, then," he snarled at last, and fled. he fled the entire section where the boys lived. In fact, for as Kurun led Avatra out of her pen, he saw the tail of the man's robe vanishing around the corner into the main corridor. "Let's get out of here," he called harshly, as human and draconic noses poked around the door frames. "We have training to do." A ragged chorus of assent met his command, and as he led Avatra toward the landing courtyard with the rain drumming down on canvas above him, he heard the slap of leather soles on the stone behind him and the clatter of dragon claws. He led the procession with his head held high and without a backward glance. He felt the Magus's glare on the back of his neck from the shelter of one of the other doorways as they passed. Avatra felt it, too, and hissed again, but made no move otherwise as he put a steadying hand on her shoulder. Let him look and glare. All he would see was Kurun doing his duty despite conditions that would excuse anyone else from fulfilling them, and Kurun's wing following their leader and their trainer, obedient and ready to serve Alta as soon as they were able. Yes, let him look. He would find no treason here. What they wanted was not treason to Alta. If anything, it would be the saving of their land. And he kept his head high as they went out in the pouring rain, secure in the sure knowledge of that, if nothing else. 19. The Magus was wont to appear out of nowhere, drop an acidic remark or an impertinent question, and wait to see how badly he had shaken his prey. He was quite successful at it most of the time. He had Akka 10 so rattled that she fled whenever he was near, and he had even the senior jousters frowning and growling into their beer. However, Kurun felt that he had gotten the upper hand on their first, and thus far only, exchange. Perhaps that was why there had not been a second one. He had not succeeded in rattling Heclatus at all, not even when the inevitable confrontation over the magic guarding his quarters came, early in the afternoon of his second day as their overseer. Kurun was privileged to be there for that incident, and to his mind, it was the one bright moment since the Magus had descended on them. He was actually seeing Heclatus for a legitimate complaint, a badly bruised forearm. The dragonettes were not big enough to do a falling man catch, so he had decided to try a different tactic. He reasoned that if they could at least slow a fall, he might get there in time to save whoever had been knocked from the saddle. So the new maneuver they were trying to perfect was of coming in under the falling body, holding it for a moment, then letting it slip only to have another dragonette come in from below for a second catch. It was a clever idea in theory. In practice, it only made the falling victim's path less predictable, and had ended up in a lot of bruises. Fortunately, even the experienced jousters, who had shunned such things before, had taken to wearing saddle straps around their waists now, and extra heavy girths on their saddles. Between the violent flying that their dragons were doing to evade projectiles from below, and their own exhaustion, no one wanted to take the chance of being knocked off a dragon in mid-flight. "Well, that's a bone bruise," said Heclatus finally, after a long and careful examination. "It is going to take a while to heal. The best I can offer you is a poultice of wormwood for the outside, and suggest a heavier hand than usual on the beer jars for the in—" "Healer!" came a furious shout from the courtyard outside, making them both jump. They stared at the cloth hanging over the door, which let fresh air in while keeping most of the bugs out, and giving some privacy. "What devilry are you up to in there?" They both recognized the voice, of course, after nearly 2 days of listening to it. "I am seeing a patient, my lord Magus," said Heclatus in a thickened version of his Akkadian accent, so that he made the word Magus sound like maggot, and Kurun had to choke down a laugh. "I beg your pardon if I fail to understand what you mean by devilry." "That magic!" shouted the Magus, and he sounded nearly beside himself with rage. "That filthy foreign magic! Your quarters are riddled with it. How dare you practice magic here? Get out here and explain yourself this instant." "Why must I come out there?" Heclatus wondered softly. "I would have expected someone like him to simply barge in here." "I don't think he can come in," whispered Kurun, with ill-concealed glee. "I don't think he can get past your wards." "Really now?" Eclatus's eyes danced with malicious merriment. What an unexpectedly pleasant side effect. "Well, I suppose we had better come out. Wait a moment, though." He took the time to tie the wet poultice he had prepared over the bruise on Karan's arm. "All right, now we go." Karan came out first, followed by the healer. The magus glared at him, and then in the same instant dismissed him as unimportant and transferred the glare to the healer. "Answer me, rot you! How dare you practice magic here?" Eclatus's brow wrinkled, and he spread his hands wide. "Forgive me, my lord, but are you referring to the young dragon rider's poultice? I assure you there is no magic there. Merely wormwood and vinegar and other herbs." "No, I am not referring to the god-rotted poultice," the magus snarled. "I am referring to magic. Your room there reeks of it. I cannot even pass the door to inspect." "Magic, my lord?" Eclatus repeated ingenuously. "But, my lord, I am a simple Akkadian healer. Where would I have learned magic?" He widened his eyes and looked as innocent as a child. "How should I know where you learned it?" countered the magus. "Wait, my lord," Eclatus interrupted him, with a wild wave of both hands. "Perhaps I know what is the cause of your misapprehension." The only word was minced, back into the workroom. Karan knew, of course, that Eclatus was one of those who preferred his own sex to that of women, but he had never ever seen Eclatus behave in a feminine manner before, much less in such an exaggerated fashion, and when he saw the look of disdain mixed with extreme discomfort on the magus's face, he knew why Eclatus was acting so out of character. A moment later now the word was definitely flounced, back out with one of the statues of his gods in his hands, specifically chosen to make the magus as uncomfortable as possible. It was the king of the Akkadian gods, stark nude, accompanied by a slender young man serving as his cupbearer, and the two of them were in a pose that suggested that it shortly wasn't going to be a cup that the young man was bearing. Akkadian art was quite realistic. The magus actually broke into a sweat. Though, judging from his words, it might not have been the subject of the statue, or at least not only the subject, that was making him sweat. "Yes," he hissed, pointing a finger at the statue. "That's one source that—" Eclatus regarded it fondly. "Well then, there is your explanation, my lord. It is not magic that you sense, but the blessing of my gods. I took all of my household images to the appropriate temples to have them blessed before I left to journey here, and I took the precaution of acquiring a large store of specially blessed amulets at the same time. I supposed that some of my patients might seek the blessing of a god when they came to me to be healed, and I was right." "Heresy," said the magus in a strangled voice. Somehow he didn't sound sincere. Not surprising, considering that what the Magi were doing, in raiding the Temple of the Twins for the Winged Ones in order to work their magic, might well actually be heresy. "I beg your pardon," Eclatus frowned. "There is no law in Alta barring the worship of other gods than those you Altans worship. The contrary, in fact. And I make offerings at both sets of altars, yours and mine, anyway. So where's the heresy on that?" "It is—" But the magus could get no further. He simply spluttered and shuffled his feet in impotent rage. "Are you suggesting that the Great Ones are planning on barring the worship of one's own gods in one's own household?" Eclatus continued, eyes glittering dangerously. "I certainly hope that is not the case. I would not remain in this city for a single moment if I thought that was true. And neither would any other Akkadian, and of course, I would have to tell my compatriots of the change in the law as soon as I could." He held out his free hand and studied his fingernails carefully. "I think the Great Ones would soon come to regret that before too long, given the kinds of positions that Akkadians fill all over the city." A veiled threat, and they both knew it. And they both knew that Akkadians did serve in key functions all over Alta, and what was more, They would pack up and leave, taking their skills and their accumulated wealth with them, if they were denied the right to have images of their choosing in their household and worship their own gods. Eclatus wasn't bluffing, and the Magus knew it. Point to Eclatus, Curran thought. The Magus seethed with impotent rage. But of course, I am sure this is all just a simple misunderstanding, Eclatus continued, turning a shining smile on the Magus. And now that you realize that what you thought was foreign magic is simply the bountiful blessing of my gods, you know that there is nothing to worry about here. Well, at least not magically speaking. To Curran's surprise and delight, Eclatus began to simper at the Magus. And I wouldn't call it worry, but unlike mighty Theus, I find older, not younger, men to be the best cup companions. The Magus made a strangled sound in the back of his throat, went dead white, and fled. Curran stuffed both hands against his mouth to keep from laughing aloud until the Magus was well out of hearing distance. It was very hard, but fortunately, he was laughing so hard that he couldn't get a sound out anyway. By that point, the convulsions that shook him made it impossible to breathe for several moments. Tears streamed down his face, and he had to sink to his knees, rocking back and forth as he clamped his arms to his sides. Finally, he sucked in air again in an enormous gasp and looked up. Eclatus's grin very nearly set him off again. "Oh, dear gods!" he gasped, tears still coursing down his cheeks. "Did you see his face?" Eclatus made a rude sound. "Ugh, as if I would touch him with a barge pole," he said cheerfully. "Let me get dear old Theus back to his altar, while you get yourself under control before you do yourself an injury. You can dislocate your own jaw by stretching it too far, you know." That just set him off again, and Eclatus made an exasperated sigh and went back inside his workroom. Fortunately, he stayed there long enough for Curran to stop laughing, wipe his eyes, and get back to his feet. "I think," the healer said as he came back into the courtyard again, "that I might just lodge an official protest with the Great Ones about this incident. I very much doubt that it will rid us of the man, but it will put them all on notice that I was serious." "Well, now we know that not only can he not scry past your wards, he can't even get physically past your wards," Curran pointed out. "That's useful." "Yes," Eclatus replied thoughtfully. "The thing is, I wonder why. My magic has never had that effect before. I shall have to look into that very carefully." "I had better get back to my wing," Curran replied, with some regret, for it was comforting, knowing he was standing in the middle of the one place in the compound that wretched Magus was never going to go. "Yes, go," Eclatus said, absently making a shooing motion. "Keep the poultice damp while you wear it, but take it off to fly or do other work, and keep it away from Avatra. I don't think she'll try to eat it, but it could make her ill." "Thank you, Hila," Curran said, but Eclatus was already going through the door curtain, mumbling something under his breath. When they all got together in Curran's room later that night, there was something waiting for him, and Curran was unsurprised to see that it was an Akkadian statue. This one he happened to know was no goddess. It was a simple artistic piece, but he had no doubt that Eclatus had put the same wards on it as were on his real god images. He decided, if asked, to claim that this was the Akkadian equivalent to Wet-Teesh, the goddess of luck and love, a rather natural deity for a young man to worship, and doubly so for a jouster. The fact that it was a fine little figure of an exceptionally lovely, completely unclothed young lady was just incidental, right? Akhet-Ten isn't going to like it, he thought, placing the image on the little shrine in the corner. He surveyed it and smiled. Eclatus certainly knew Curran's taste very well. Akhet-Ten is going to have to get over it. There was plenty of Altan art, well, perhaps not plenty, but certainly a reasonable amount, including on the walls of the public places in Lord Yatiran's villa, that depicted dancing girls wearing little more than a string of beads. There was no logical reason for her to take exception to this piece, which meant, of course, in the contrary nature of girls, that she would. The others noticed the addition, the boys with sly looks and elbows to each other's ribs, and Akhet-Ten with a frown, then a disdainful sniff, and he explained what had happened that afternoon with great gusto. When he got to the part about Heklatis flirting with the Magus, even Akhet-Ten had to stifle howls of laughter. "I know I've seen this in Heklatis's rooms," he said, gesturing to the statue. "And I think I'm probably supposed to say it's an Akkadian goddess he gave me. If this does what I think it's going to do, it'll keep that rotted Magus out of here as well." Akhet-Ten turned a look on the statue that, had it been wood instead of marble, would have set it afire. "I think it should have been that image of Epialon then," she said pointedly, her brows furrowing in a frown. "Now, Akhet-Ten, you know that you'd never get Heklatis to part with any of his handsome lads," teased Gan. "This was probably the only image he didn't want to keep for himself." Akhet-Ten colored and opened her mouth to say something when she was interrupted by noises outside the door. It was Avatra, snorting and rearing up out of her sand like a rising cobra. There was someone shadowed against the light of the corridor in the doorway to the pen. For one moment, Karun felt a jolt of alarm. "Avatra," came a hissing whisper out of the dark. "Hush, it's only me." "Merit!" exclaimed Karun, more quick-witted than the rest in recognizing the voice and realizing that the silhouette was too short to be the Magus. "What are you doing here?" "Us," corrected Merit, and Avatra also bleatedly recognized her voice and settled back into her wallow with a grumble. And indeed it was two figures, not one, that emerged, blinking into the light spilling from the doorway. At first glance, it was hard to tell which of the girls that pulled back the hoods on their rain capes as Merit. They were, literally, alike as two barley grains. Or at least it seemed that way to Karun. But evidently Akhet-Ten had some arcane way, unknown to mere males, of telling them apart, for she looked at the left-hand one of the pair and said sharply, "Nofret! What are you doing here?" The handsome young woman turned grave, faintly shadowed eyes on Akhet-Ten and said simply, "Escaping." Both of them put down bundles that had been hidden beneath their capes. "We assumed that the worst had already happened to us," Merit said bitterly. "We were wrong." "What worst?" said Akhet-Ten. "You haven't been banished or anything, have you?" Nofret sighed. "No, but believe me, it is a good thing that Toreth and Caleth taught us about making many plans, well ahead of time, because we needed them." Merit nodded, and the two of them pulled off their rain capes and settled down onto cushions that the other boys offered. Karun noticed that they were dressed, oddly enough, in simple clothing, more like that one of their servants would have worn. This afternoon the entire court was summoned by the Great Ones after a long morning council meeting. The first we knew about it was when the great ladies sent us to be bathed and dressed by their servants. By the time we got our wits about us, we were already in a procession, and the next thing we knew, a new royal clan had been made, and we were being betrothed to a pair of magi we'd never seen before. And if they're twins, said Nofret, with a lift of her eyebrow and a toss of her head, I am a dragon. "What did you do?" asked Gan, looking utterly stunned. "We went along with it, of course," Nofret replied. "The vows aren't valid. These men aren't in a royal clan, no matter what the Great Ones decree. The laws of the gods say that you can't create a new royal clan unless an old one dies out. And even if both our betrothed were dead, which they aren't, we can't be wedded to anyone who is not of royal blood without our consent, which we did not give and were not asked during the ceremony. No matter what words were spoken over us, we are not betrothed in the eyes of the gods, and that is all Merit and I care about." Merit nodded. "When Toreth died, we knew it was always possible we would be asked to marry others in the royal clans. Well, Nofret anyway. When Caleth went away, we did think it was possible we both might have to, so we started making plans of what to do." Now Nofret smiled fondly on her sister. "I didn't care. I liked Toreth well enough. He was a good boy, but She shrugged. Marriage to him would have been fine, but marriage to anyone else who is tolerable would also have been fine. But Merritt truly loves Caliph, and I won't let her be forced away from him. So we began laying all sorts of plans. We even tried to think of ways of faking our own deaths. I must say, though, it never occurred to us that the Great Ones would have done something like this. But we knew if we made a fuss, we would be watched like vials of saffron. But if we acted happy about it, which we did, we'd be allowed to do anything we pleased. So we acted like children given sticks of honey, said Merritt, her nose wrinkled with scorn. Everyone must think we're brainless, or that we're frantic to get any husband, or else that we're so desperate to get back into the succession that we'd willingly marry the sacred baboons. Nofret made sure of that by babbling about how honored and thankful she was and hanging all over that repulsive reptile they betrothed her to, as if he was a god, and when I figured out what she was doing, I just did the same. Oh, yes, Nofret smiled cynically. I was full of questions for the great ladies afterward. How quickly could we be married? Would we have our places back in the order of precedence? How soon could our husbands be confirmed in the succession? When we were wedded, would we get to wear the lesser crowns? Would we have our own set of ladies and attendants suitable to our station? I think I was being so greedy there at the end that even the great ladies were beginning to wonder if this had been a good idea after all. Merritt tilted her head to one side knowingly. Serves them right. There were a lot of honors we could have claimed that we didn't because Toreth and Caliph couldn't be bothered with court functions. I started talking about having a lesser court of our own. That made them really nervous. And they should be, said Herclatus, slipping into the room behind them like a ghost. I wonder if the Great Ones will ever realize that the moment you wed, their days are numbered. No one even jumped. They were all so used to Herclatus coming and going silently that they just nodded at him. Perhaps the ladies will, Nofret replied. We certainly did our best to put the idea in their heads with our questions. Hello, Herclatus. We've run away. So I gathered. And since there is no hue and cry being raised across the First Canal, I assume you found a way to do so without raising suspicion? Herclatus said easily, taking a place next to Karun and looking around at them all. Hello, Karun. Did you like my little gift? I left one for Akat 10 too just now. Hermia, goddess of the hearth. I never much cared for that image, a little too placid and bovine for my taste. You can claim she's Athera, your cow goddess, the wet nurse of the god Haras, if I recall. I'm sure our friend will find that to be a suitably appropriate and pious image for a proper young lady to worship, he sniggered. Akat 10 scowled, but didn't immediately reply, since Nofret was already talking. We're officially on religious retreat in the temple of Athera, as a matter of fact, Nofret told them. And it wasn't even our idea. Our original plan was to be such a plague that the great ladies would send us to Father's country estate, but this was even better. Merritt chuckled. After we began asking all those questions, the great ladies suddenly recalled that when a new royal clan marries into the succession, the brides must spend a moon in religious retreat and introduction in a temple of their choice before the wedding. Of course, we have never heard of anything of the sort, but we agreed to it with some pouting and chose the goddess Athera because they haven't got one single priestess of noble blood there. And it's brilliant. It couldn't fit any better with our plans. We are supposed to leave all our attendants behind, be escorted by royal guards to whom one lady looks like every other lady, and live as the priestesses do. So they won't know that Nofret and Merritt that left the palace in their rain capes and their escort are not us, said Nofret. All that they will see is a pair of twins. Right, I've got that part, said Karun. But where did you find substitutes? She sighed heavily. Do you have any idea how often someone thinks that a clever gift for twins is a pair of twin-body slaves? We just looked through our handmaidens until we found the ones we thought stood the best chance of carrying off the deception. We explained the situation to them, and divided our jewels with them, which, after 2 sets of betrothal gifts in addition to what we already owned, is more than we could carry anyway. They'll be under guard, of course, which will give us at least a few days and possibly a week or 2 before they escape and run away. Well, that explained the plain linen shifts and horsehair wigs. Merritt wrung out the hem of her shift and added, "Of course, they won't be in any danger of being caught, because the Great Ones and the Magi will be looking for Nofret and Merritt, not a pair of escaped slaves." And Merritt and Nofret ordered the 2 slaves here as a gift for Akhet 10, so they won't even be missing from our entourage at the palace. Nofret smiled in triumph, and Karan didn't blame her. The plan was very, very clever. Except perhaps for one small detail. "What if they betray you?" he asked. Merritt made a sour face. "That's the first thing we made sure of. They're Tian and their slaves. We explained to them, in great detail, just how they would be questioned if they betrayed us, because no one would ever believe that they didn't know every detail of our plans now, would they? And Tian slaves, well, I reminded them that it would never even occur to anyone to reward them for betraying us. I pointed out that they would be the first to be suspected, reminded them of what the Magi did to Torith, to the Winged Ones, and everyone who was in the way when they opened the eye. I told them what I knew about how the Inquisitors question slaves, which is rather more than I actually want to know, to tell you the truth, and pointed out that there are a lot more options open to someone torturing a female." Eclatus looked at her with awestruck fascination. "You horrible young woman," he said, admiration in his voice. "Not horrible," Nofret corrected. "Brutally honest and realistic. I didn't enjoy telling them, and I wasn't trying to intimidate them. We gave them the truth, and then a chance to escape with wealth. We picked the cleverest because they have the best chance of escaping quickly, and we picked the temple they have the best chance of escaping from. On the whole, I think we should be commended. They certainly didn't seem displeased with the bargain." "They didn't have a choice, though," said Karan doubtfully. "They didn't have a choice about being made slaves either," Nofret retorted. "They were lucky past all reason. They could have been bought by a brothel and weren't. They could have been bought by almost anyone to serve as pleasure slaves and escaped that fate too. Instead, they were bought and given to us, and then got a chance to take back their freedom, all for the price of silence, a little play-acting, and some cleverness in escaping. In their position, I would be weeping with gratitude in front of the statue of Athera tonight, and planning to offer prayers of thanksgiving for the rest of my life once I got away." "She has a point," Karan conceded. "So, now I assume you want us to get you... where?" asked Gan. "To Caliph," said Merritt immediately. "He's managed to get 3 messages smuggled to me since he left. The last one said, 'The hawk rises above the storm, the desert finds its own.'" Karan, Eclatus, and Akhet 10 exchanged looks. It was Eclatus who spoke slowly, as if he was thinking aloud. "The boy has the seer's eye," he said, "and he's with the mouths, who presumably have something of the same and can teach him how to call visions instead of waiting to be struck by them. We all know how he feels about you, Merritt." She colored, and Nofret bit her lip, and looked pensive. "And it is reasonable to assume he has been trying to watch you from a distance. So it is also reasonable that if he can get you to the edge of the desert, he will know, or possibly already knows, where you will be." Akhet 10 shrugged when Merritt looked to her for confirmation of this speculation. "I can't think of any other interpretation. The question is how we can get you there quickly, and with as little to track you by as possible." "Amulets will take care of the latter," said Eclatus, sucking on his lower lip. "But we fly you out," Karan said suddenly. "That's what the first part of the message means. Or we fly you as far as Avatra and Rieth-Ka can take you in half a day. Thank the gods this happened during the rains. Akhet 10 and I have already gone up above the clouds, and the winds can take us a long way without the dragons tiring. Rieth-ka can carry double. Since 2 girls are light, Avatra is big enough to carry double and baggage. Ha! Said Haklatus, slapping his thigh and startling them all. Hoist on their own tackle! I can borrow those winds that the Magi are using, or one of them anyway, to take you straight west in the morning and straight east in the afternoon. As fast as that air is moving, it will take you all the way to the desert and back with no one the wiser. Akhet-Ten grinned for the first time. No one is going to miss us for that long, are they? Karan shook his head. No, they won't. And even if someone were to come out to watch us, they won't stay for long, because there's nothing to see once the dragons are in the air. Look, here's what we'll do. Merit and Nofret slept in Akhet-Ten's room, secure in the knowledge that with Haklatus's guardian goddess there, the Magi would not be able to spy on the chamber. In the morning, everyone behaved absolutely normally. The Magus did not even glare at them more than usual. Karan suspected that this might be because he was not aware that 2 of Haklatus's blessed statues had come to roost elsewhere. It had occurred to him before he went to sleep that night that the Magus could not seem to sense other magic unless he actively ran into it, either by trying to use his own magic or by physically crossing it. So, since he would not try to go into a dragon pen anymore, they were safe from discovery for a while. Of the lot of them, if he was searching for pockets of discontent or conspiracies among Torith and Calith's friends, he would be looking at the nobly born boys who had been the twin prince's childhood friends, not Karan or Akhet-Ten. Karan, after all, had no real power and no influential friends except Lord Yatiran, who was well known for his retiring nature, and Akhet-Ten had been playing the part of a frightened mouse. They went out to practice as usual, and as often happened, a couple of dragon boys, muffled in rain capes and carrying heavy bundles, went out to the practice field, ostensibly to assist. But there wasn't anyone in the compound who noticed their departure, as Haklatus was supposed to make very sure, and there wasn't anyone at the practice field to see their arrival, as Karan and the rest made very sure. They all landed for equipment checks, and the dragon boys moved in among them. There certainly wasn't anyone to see that when the dragons took off again, Akhet-Ten had a second rider strapped in behind her, while Karan had another and both bundles. Avatra lumbered heavily into the air, taking a good long while to get up to speed with her triple burden. She didn't complain, though, and Karan didn't feel any faltering in her wing beats, so he assumed that she was all right with the extra weight. When he gave her the signal to go up farther than she was used to in this weather, though, he sensed her hesitation. He gave it to her again, with a little more force. She thought about his command for a moment, but before she could make up her mind, Rieth-ka shot past them, heading straight up into the clouds. Either that decided her, or else Akhet-Ten had managed to speak with her to tell her what they wanted, and that there would be sunlight up there. With a snort, she followed. The journey was a repetition of the one they had taken on that pair of swamp dragons, when he and Akhet-Ten had gone up to spread the dust, but without quite as much of the buffeting inside the clouds as the last time, as Avatra was hit by contrary winds, by unexpected updrafts and even a downdraft or 2 that made his stomach plunge and his passenger scream with fear. He thought that the turbulence was perhaps half that of the initial storm, and if that pig of a swamp dragon could handle it. His steadiness seemed to give Avatra confidence, and she fought her way back after every obstacle. Finally, she lifted her head a little as if she sensed something. At that moment, it seemed to Karan that the rain-filled mist above him was marginally brighter. With a mighty surge of wings and the added help of another unexpected updraft, they burst out of the clouds and into the sunlight. Despite their head start and Rieth-ka's lighter burden, it was a moment or 2 after that before Akhet-Ten and her passenger lumbered up into the light, and they did so a good 6 furlongs away from Avatra. Following Karan's signals, Avatra wheeled toward them. He wanted to be closer before they tried the next part of the journey. It was then that he noticed that his passenger was clutching him around the waist so tightly that, if he had not been wearing the Alta Jousters' broad, thick leather belt that protected the midsection, he'd have been having trouble breathing. "Are you all right?" he called back over his shoulder. "No," said a strangled voice in his ear. "But don't stop!" He spared a brief thought of "poor thing" for her, but had no time for anything more. The next bit would be tricky and required a lot of concentration. As he now knew from experience, the winds up this high were layered. While he had never yet come across one layer going in the completely opposite direction of another, he had encountered winds moving at right angles to each other. The Magi probably paid very little attention to their magic once they set it in motion, and as long as the rains went south, that was all they cared about. There was a single channel of wind up here, above the clouds and rain that Heclatus had purloined, deflecting it so that instead of going north to south, it curved off to the west. It would be high, Heclatus had told him. Perhaps higher than he had ever flown before, and Avatra, who could read the winds better than he, and who had more experience than Rieth-Ka, would have to find it. He signaled to Akhet-Ten, who nodded vigorously, then sent Avatra up. She was not at all averse to this idea. This clear, dry air was much more to her liking than spending the day trying to fly through the pouring rain. It was cold and getting colder. He was glad of the extra clothing they were wearing. He and Akhet-Ten were wearing those woolen garments. Nofret and Merit had to make do with a pair of woolen robes with the skirts cut and bound around their legs. At least they were drying out quickly. Avatra seemed unhampered by the cold. Up she went, with Karun consistently giving her the signal that she should go west. And she tried, with the strong winds up here carrying them farther south all the time as she tacked against them. And she kept looking, craning her neck around, searching. He had the feeling she knew what he was asking of her. When they planned this last night, he had wondered if she would understand what she needed to do without Akhet-Ten being able to give her clear directions. The up part was easy, but she had not flown on a long flight since they had arrived in Alta. Would she understand that they needed to take one now? Her bright eyes darted this way and that as she continued to climb, continued to fight the south-flowing winds. And then, just as he had seen her sense the clear air above them, he saw her find something else. It was nothing that he could see, but she did, and she redoubled her efforts, driving strongly upward toward a place in the sky that seemed no different to him than any other place in the sky, until she was in the middle of it. And then, then she spread her wings wide, and suddenly they were shooting westward, in the middle of a current that took them at right angles to the flowing of the clouds underneath them. This time, with something to compare their speed to, it was clear that they were flying at a dizzying pace, both the highest and fastest that he had ever flown before. He glanced around and caught a glimpse of Akhet-Ten right behind him. That was all he needed to know, that and the position of the sun. When it was at its zenith, they would have to go down, no matter where they were, because at that point, this wind would die for a while and then reverse itself. They hoped that this would be somewhere that Caliph was waiting for them, but Karun did not believe in counting on hope alone, no more than Nofret and Merit did. The boys had together scraped up enough ordinary currency in bronze and silver to get a cart and donkey. He and Akhet-Ten should have enough time to find a farm, buy a cart and donkey, and send the young women out to the desert's edge, where they could sell the cart and donkey and have enough money to provision themselves when they took some of their jewels apart and pounded things like rings and delicate ornaments into unrecognizable bits of silver, electrum, and gold. Then, if Caliph had still not put in an appearance, they could go to one of the places at the desert's edge where the Bedou came to trade and buy their way into one of the encampments and wait there. Karun never counted on anything, especially not luck. But before the sun reached the appointed spot, the clouds began to thin in front of them. Soon there were gaps below where Karun could see the green of the farmlands. And then, when he looked ahead, he realized that it was not the white of more clouds that formed the horizon, but the white sands of the desert. And the farms beneath turned to scrub, the scrub to dryscape plants, and then, just as the wind dropped away to nothing and Avatra went into a long, slow glide downward, the sparse desert edge plants turned to true desert. This was the moment that he realized just how high they were. His passenger realized it at the same moment that he did. She shrieked in his ear, startling Avatra into a side slip, and buried her face in his shoulder. He didn't blame her. Their woolens had kept them warm, but it had been a bit hard to get his breath. Now he knew why. Suddenly Riethka folded her wings and went into a dive. Taken by complete surprise, he only had the wit to direct Avatra to follow her, and follow she did. It was not the sort of heart-thumping, near-vertical stoop that he and Akhet had endured on their first such flight, but it was steep enough, and he heard his passenger's muffled wails of pure terror against his shoulder. Riethka evidently saw something that he couldn't, for she had her eyes fixed on some point in the blank expanse of desert below. This was not so much a dive as a series of steep spirals. The dragons were somehow steering with their tails, and had just enough wing extended to slow their fall a little. About the time when he made out that little thing that Riethka had spotted was a group of 4 beasts and 2 men. She tucked her hindquarters under and fanned her wings more, slowing the dive even further. A moment later, Avatra did the same. When he made out that the riders were muffled in Bedu robes and veils, and the beasts were camels, they were moving no faster than they usually were when they made landings, and they were spiraling down in a series of shallow, lazy circles, while the men and beasts watched, the men calmly, the camels nervously. The honks and groans of their companions drifted up to him, and one of the men laughed at something the other said. Then the wings of both dragons snapped open to the fullest, simultaneously, and they began back-winging furiously. They touched down within a heartbeat of each other. Kurun's passenger might have been still too terrified to move. That was not the case with the other passenger. She had unbuckled her restraining strap and was sliding down Riethka's back unassisted while the dust they had kicked up was still settling. One of the men had jumped out of his saddle and began trotting toward them. She hardly seemed to touch the ground as she ran to meet him, cape flying behind her. He caught her up in a tight embrace and held her, while Kurun muttered to the young woman behind him, "You can look up now, Nofret. We're down. Calith's here, and something a little easier to ride is with him." "I'm not a coward," came the trembling reply. "You'd be a fool if that ride hadn't terrified you," Kurun replied, "and you didn't have anything to take your mind off the end of it. Here, I'll help you." He helped her to detach her icy cold, fear-rigid fingers from his belt, while the second man took something off the back of one of the camels and beckoned to Akhet. By the time he got Nofret down off the back of Avatra, Akhet was dragging a woven palm leaf cloth full of dead goat over to Riethka, who had her neck stretched out toward it, nostrils flared. The man was dragging a second such burden right behind her. While Riethka started hungrily on the first installment of her meal, Akhet took the second from him. Kurun caught up with the man at the camels, and they brought both halves of Avatra's meat to her. Calith had thought of everything, but then he should have figured on that. Even before the wings descended on him, Calith tried to think of everything. Merritt and Calith were still locked in their embrace, to no one's surprise. Nofret was sitting on her baggage, which she had managed to get down off Avatra's back, her head in her hands, now the very image of patient waiting.
"Well, I see you have left Vetch far behind you, Jouster," said the Bedu in an amused voice. "And I see that your clan has prospered enough to afford us 4 goats this time, mouth of the Bedu," Kurun replied with a lopsided grin. "Oh, they have been paid for, be assured of that, Kurun of Alta," said the Bedu. "We have found your city, and have renamed it Sanctuary. As the young eyes of Alta foresaw, there was treasure there, enough to provision it and make it ready." So the lost city really did exist. He thought longingly of it. It would be so good not to have to go back, to be able to fly on, into the clean desert, and land at the end of the journey in a place where he did not have to fear spying eyes and the fingers of accusation. But he still had a great task unfinished. "Let's hope it is indeed a sanctuary for those who need it," he said stoically, as Merritt and Calith at last broke their embrace, and finally came to help Nofret with the bags. Riethka had finished the last of her meal. Avatra was on the last mouthful. "Right now, if we aren't to need it prematurely, We need to get back. I want our part in this to be over with as little shed blood as may be, and that will need all 9 of us." "Indeed." The mouth bowed his head, then raised it again and looked at Karun shrewdly. "In the depths of the night we count those whose lives our actions have cost. Yet the gods never tell us the numbers of those whose lives were spared because of what we have done. You may choose to think on that when the night seems long." He blinked owlishly above his veil. "And that it is as it is. Your part is yet to come, and after that, it is in the hands of the gods. Fly fast and safe, Jouster. We will meet in Sanctuary." Akhet 10 was already in the saddle again, buckling on her restraining strap. She looked back at him, grinned, but gestured upward. He took the hint and signaled Avatra to kneel, climbing up in the saddle himself. "Ride swift and safe, mouth of the Bedu," he replied as he buckled on his strap. "We meet in Sanctuary." His last sight of them, as the 2 dragons clawed for height into the clear sky, was of the 4 camels plodding back into the desert. He hoped that whatever was to come, Sanctuary would live up to its name. 20. It didn't look like anything at all, really. Just a faint grayish haze on the surface of the 3 ripe tala berries in Karun's hand. It could have been dust, except that it didn't rub off. It could have been almost anything, or nothing at all, and just an odd color on the hard little berries. Karun handed them back to Heclatus, who took them with a smile and raised an eyebrow. "The harvest looks good this year," he said. "Yes," Heclatus replied blandly. "They're all like that, plump and well-colored. From here to the southern border of Tia, or so I'm told by the few who venture there. Whatever else, the rains were good for the Tala." Lord Kaman nodded gravely. "So a week to dry, and then we can use them, which is just as well, since I think we have scarcely a week in stockpile." He knew, of course. He had frowned at the odd color of the berries, had looked up at Heclatus, who had nodded, then the both of them smiled just a little. Karun contained his glee with an effort, for he knew that the Tians had no more Tala stockpiled than the Altans did. The Altan agents had not been able to steal any Tala, but they had done the next best thing. During the rains, they had made holes in the roofs of the storage rooms where it was kept to deny it to the enemy. The rain and the rot that followed spoiled it, or most of it. Only the Tala actually stored at the Jousters' compound had been spared. Lord Kamun's smile was a weary one. Once the rains had ended, his lot had been fraught with difficulty, for the Magus placed in governance over all of them had flexed his muscles and ordered impossible things. A return to traditional jousting, that had been the first thing, of course. Well, he could order all he wanted, but the Magi could not compel obedience on the battlefield, at least not yet, and the Jousters had bowed their heads and continued with Karun's tactics. But besides that, he had ordered all of them into the sky twice a day, every day, with no rest and little recovery for the injured, and that was taking a toll on them. As tired as they had been during the rains, they were bone-weary now. Lord Kamun's sad smile told Karun that he would be glad to see an end to the situation at last, even though it meant there would be no more jousters, and he would have no more command. Karun could not imagine what the Magi were thinking of. Were they trying to be rid of the jousters themselves? It seemed unlikely. Or were they trying to get rid of the old jousters, seeking to replace them with young men of their choosing? Karun decided to ask Heclatus about that, this evening. Right now he had a practice session to run. They had gone back to using that distant practice field the day that the rains started to taper off, even though the senior jousters were so much in the air that they didn't have time, much less the need, to practice. Karun didn't want an audience where the Magi could see that they had gathered one. He did not want attention drawn to his wing. They did have an audience, though, for their new exercises, which were quite exciting, even though there wasn't a single person out there other than the wing and Heclatus who knew what they were for.
He got back to the pen in time to find his dragon boy cinching the last strap down on Avatra. He checked them all, as he always did, and smiled. "Good job," he said, "as always." The lad grinned as he gave Avatra the command to kneel. No more vaulting into the saddle from the ground for him any more. Avatra had gotten too big for that. There was absolutely no doubt in his mind now that Tala slowed the dragon's growth, as well as dulling their minds and instincts. Avatra was much bigger than her mother had been, and might even be a hair bigger than Cachette when he last saw Ari's dragon. And she still had another 2 to 4 years of growth ahead of her. She was bigger than every other adult dragon in the compound. He gave her the signal to fly, and she leaped straight up from the pen, just as Cachette always did. He took her up over the compound and waited, circling on a thermal, while the rest finished their harnessing and joined him. They lined up in a V-shaped formation, with Avatra at the point, and headed for the practice grounds. He was the target, since Avatra was the oldest and most experienced flyer. By now she could perform everything he remembered Cachette doing, which meant that she could outperform most, if not all, of the Tian dragons. The exercises they were all running now, which would be crucial very soon, were harassing maneuvers. Karun had gone to the swamps and watched as the swamp dragons challenged each other and drove each other out of hunting territories. Then he had come home and taught the harassment techniques to the wing. Avatra hated this. What the others were doing spoke to her deepest instincts, and she wanted badly to turn on them. That she didn't bespoke her deep bond of trust with Karun. He only wished he could reward her patience as it deserved. Tala drugged dragons would respond with irritation and would continue to obey their riders. Undrugged dragons, or those for whom the Tala was wearing off, would try to chase the interlopers out of their territory until they realized that the dragon was immature. He'd seen that, too, in the swamp. Then they would realize that there was a sky full of better targets and potential mates, and there were wretched little hairless baboons on their backs that should be gotten rid of before the proper business of draconic life could be taken up. And that would be the end of the Jousters. There was still one more matter that he had not come up with a plan for, warning the Altan Jousters of what was to come. He wanted to do that. It didn't seem at all fair not to. But there might be one or more among them who would tell the Magus, and he did not know what would happen then. But that was a week or more away, and he still had time to think of a plan, or so he hoped. They arrived at the practice field, which was just on the inside of the 7th Canal. On the other side were the great estates and small, unprotected villages. He was not particularly surprised to see that there was a crowd gathered to watch. At least, this was so far out that it was unlikely there were any magi here to note that they were not practicing traditional jousting. He set Avatra up. The others went higher. Each of them would take it in turn to harass her. She hissed. She knew what was coming, and she hated it. The wild-caught dragons would hate it even more. And when the battle was over, and all the dragons scattered, Karun's wing would fly due west until, well, probably until they picked up a guide at the edge of the desert. Caliph had found them once. Presumably he would find them again. It was a more tenuous plan that Karun liked, but it was a lot less fragile than it had been before Merit and Nofret had been forced to flee. The search for them had begun, discreetly, 2 weeks after their actual escape, but it had not been kept quiet for long. Too many people knew, and more people were involved all the time as the search spread outward. Nothing had been found. Their choice of collaborators had been perfect. Not that this had stopped the Magi's plan. The twin Magi had simply been re-betrothed to another set of girl twins. Only this was a pair of toddlers. The marriage would not be able to take place for another decade at best, though this was nothing more than a postponement. Given their recent record, it was entirely possible that the spouses of some other set of royal female twins, including the current heirs apparent, might come to an unfortunate end. People would talk, but if nothing could be proved... Uras and his dragon came down first. Karun ducked. As they flew by close enough that Tathulan's talons brushed his back. Avatra snapped. He didn't bother to stop her reflexive action. because their enemies would do the same, and he wanted the youngsters to learn to avoid the deadly jaws. Tathulan dodged neatly out of the way with a squeal, and Huras sideslipped her out of the way. It was all horribly depressing, and it made Karan want to throw himself into a canal and drown sometimes. Only the promise of Calith's visions kept him going these days, for if things in the compound were bad, things in the city were worse. It seemed as if every time he looked, someone else had been taken up for treason. The Temple of the Twins was actually closed, supposedly because the Winged Ones were so important to Alta. They were husbanding their strength so that they could answer the Great One's needs on the instant. Karan knew the truth, though, and it was exactly as he and Akhet-Ten had feared. The Magi had exhausted the fledglings completely, leaving many of them without power anymore, and even some feeble-minded or comatose. The Winged Ones, older and stronger and better trained, had resisted being burned out in that way, and now that the rains were over, they might be left alone to recover. But with no new fledglings left to train to replace those who had failed, and another season of rains ahead, there was no telling what was going to happen. Certainly the people of Alta were now vulnerable to earthshakes in a way that they had not been for generations, and already there had been mutterings about testing the healers to see if they could aid the Magi as well as the Winged Ones could. Heklatis said there was a rebellion among the healers, though, so much so that no Magi would be allowed to get near the Temple of All Gods, much less inside it. And if anyone tried, well, they would have to bring a force big enough to overpower all the healers and all their servants, and there were weapons being improvised that would probably break any spells of coercion, such as were apparently used on the Winged Ones. Heklatis said such things required the Magi's concentration. They'd be hard put to concentrate after getting facefuls of vinegar or lemon juice, or having leeches drop from the ceiling on them, if the healers felt savage. You shouldn't anger someone who knows as much about pain as a healer does. Riethka and Manetka's Bethlin came in together, one on either side of him, moving fast enough to knock Avatra down a few feet with the turbulence of their passing. Avatra was too busy trying to recover to notice that Orist's blue waistette was right behind them. He came in low enough to snatch one of the tearaway streamers from Avatra's saddle with his foreclaws. Avatra was enraged and gave chase. Karan was thrilled. They could get an entire wing aroused with a single pass with moves like that. And just as Avatra started to gain on the fledgling dragonettes, they parted, going left, right, and straight up. And there, coming straight at them, was Osset Ra and Apet-Ma. Avatra yelped and folded her wings to drop. Apet-Ma passed right through the spot where she had been. Poor Avatra had had enough. She went all the way to the ground, and Karan had to spend a goodly amount of time soothing her hurt feelings while the others chased after each other to catch streamers in a general melee. She might have a ruffled temper, but he was extremely satisfied. The Tala could run out tomorrow, and they would be ready, except for telling their own jousters what was about to happen. He still had no answer for that question. When they got back to the compound, they all landed in the landing courtyard. Not even Avatra was skilled enough yet to land in her own pen. Once down, he made sure to spend some time walking Avatra around to all the other dragons before they all went back to their pens, to make certain they were all friends again. Akhet-Ten went with them, talking to Avatra about it, and to the others as well. "Does it do any good?" he asked her anxiously as they walked Avatra and Riethka back together. "Do they understand?" "Actually, I think so. More each time we do this. Avatra understands that this is part of training, and I think she understands that the others are harassing her because their riders are asking them to, not because this was their idea." She smiled slightly. "I was going to say, not because they want to, but I'm afraid they get a great deal of gleeful pleasure out of harassing her and getting away with it. But it's like good-natured children being given permission to be naughty, not real aggression." "Good," he said with a sigh of relief. "The last thing we need is to have them start attacking each other right now." They parted then, with Akhet-Ten taking Riethka on back to her pen, and Karan turning into Avatra's. He and his dragon boy got her unharnessed and fed. Once she had settled, he went to see Heclatus. He found the healer with one of the senior jousters, splinting a broken arm. Curran was shocked. A broken arm was not the only injury the man had sustained. His face was a mass of bruises, and so was the half of his body that had the broken arm.
"What happened?"
he blurted. The man grunted.
"Strap saved my life. Tian had a lance with a wood core and a stone tip inside the papyrus. If I hadn't been belted into the saddle, I'd be dead."
It was a little hard to understand him. His lips and jaw were so swollen that his words were slurred and muffled.
"They were following orders,"
Heclatus said neutrally.
"They were jousting. However, no one told them that the Tians had no lances." "They got dragons to start with, and lances like that. We've not got a chance," the jouster growled.
He might have said more, but at that moment, Lord Kaman, and what seemed like all of the senior jousters in the compound, descended on Heclatus's quarters like a storm. All of them were shouting, or at least talking at once, and all of them were angry. Heclatus shook his head at them. Curran couldn't make out more than a word or two either. Finally, Lord Kaman held up a hand for silence. Miraculously, he got it.
"What is this all about?"
Heclatus asked, aghast.
"The Magus just gave us orders that every senior jouster is to fly every flight, no matter what,"
shouted someone from the back.
"He included everyone on the injured list by name, even you, Arshepta."
"What?" The injured man and Heclatus spoke, or rather bellowed, at the same time. The cacophony started again. Lord Kaman held up his hand, and it died. But it was Curran who spoke first.
"My lords,"
he said, enunciating each word with such care that he was sure even the most stupid of them would understand that he meant something far more than he was saying.
"I do believe that my wing and I can help you with some new strategy. Will you rouse your mounts and come with me to our practice field? Lord Kaman, I can take you. Heclatus, you should go with Akhet 10. And my lord Arshepta, I believe you ought to ride behind Huras, rather than flying just now. Will you come?"
They stared at him for a moment, as if he was a baboon that had somehow produced human speech. Then Lord Kaman said,
"Jousters, I think this is a very good idea. We need to practice where no one will interfere with us."
There were still looks of total bewilderment, but no one demurred. In fact, after the first few began taking hesitant steps toward their dragon pens, the rest followed. Curran and Heclatus helped the injured jouster to his feet and made their way to the boys' pens. Fortunately, he met them in the corridor just as they were about to go elsewhere.
"Get the dragons harnessed and up,"
he ordered shortly, to their astonishment.
"We need to go to the practice field. Akhet 10, you have Heclatus. Huras, you take this man. Fast. I want to get there and be back before anyone notices."
The wing understood, at any rate, and to his immense satisfaction, although they were the last to know, they were all the first into the air, even Huras, with the injured jouster. They led the way to their field and landed there. The dragons had all just been fed and drugged and were sleepy, and while they were irritated at being forced to fly, they were inclined to lie right down on the warm grass in the sun and bask rather than quarrel or wander. Simply staking their reins down kept them in one place. The jousters all gathered around Curran and Lord Kaman, who both looked at Heclatus.
"Give me a moment,"
the healer muttered. He closed his eyes and began to chant under his breath, and shortly he was sweating as if he was trying to shove a heavy stone up a ramp all by himself. He grew paler, too, and just when he began to sway a little with exhaustion, he stopped, opened his eyes, and sat down hard in the grass.
"They won't find us, not for a while,"
he said heavily.
"And if they try to scry, what they'll see is all of you practicing up there."
He pointed at the sky above.
"He's a magus, as well as a healer,"
Curran explained to the baffled faces.
And that's where our story begins, I suppose. He explained everything, Torith's original plan, and why he had decided to make the Jousters into a force to make the teens forge a real peace, their long discussions, the change in the plan after Torith's murder by the Magi, Calith's visions, and finally what they had done to the Tala. "In a few days, you'll be using the new stuff," he told them, "and so will they. Once the dragons aren't drugged anymore, we thought they would probably obey for a while out of habit, but we planned to go along on the last flight and goad the Tian dragons into rage, so they'll throw their riders and escape. We were going to warn you so that you could ride your dragons down to the ground and turn them loose." Silence. Karun began to sweat. Told out like this to senior jousters, it didn't seem like such a good plan anymore. "The Magi are trying to kill us anyway," growled the injured man. "Isn't that obvious? It's better to be a live dog than a dead lion." After a moment, there was some muttering of agreement. "But why?" asked someone else in a bewildered voice. "That's what I don't understand." All eyes went back to Karun, who was still in a cold sweat. "I don't know," he said finally. "But at practice today, I started to wonder something. What if they wanted to replace all of you with their own men? I mean, Heclatus thinks that the eye can't be used on cloudy days or at night, and it's not really good enough to get one person, but a dragon and a rider are. What if they wanted to replace all of you with men who would follow orders, and if those orders were to use your dragons on Altans, would do it without question?" Silence again, but this time utterly stunned. The injured man sat down with a thud. "Blessed gods," said one. Heclatus looked as if he had swallowed a sea urchin. "The theory fits," he said, with so much barely suppressed rage in his voice that those nearest him took a step back. "And what a fine way to besiege a place and prevent anyone who might help from coming near it, such as the Temple of all Gods." A gasp met his words, but no one disagreed with him. That this violated everything every Altan believed in was so obvious that it didn't need saying. It was Lord Kaman who broke that third silence by turning to Karun, removing his sash of office, and offering it to Karun. "It's your plan, young Lord Karun," he said simply. "Lead us." Karun stared at the sash, then into Lord Kaman's face. All he could feel was panic. All he could think of was, "I don't want to be a leader." But his hands took the sash by themselves. His mouth opened, and words came out. "I think that this will work." Above the wing, nothing but sky. Below the wing, so far below that they looked like fancifully colored little songbirds, were the dragons of Alta. "You have ordered all the jousters into the sky, my Lord Magus. We are not the best, but we are ready." For the past 2 days, the dragons had been restive, as the old Tala wore out of their systems. By now the larger dragons of Tia must be getting very touchy indeed. Their dragon boys would be giving them higher doses of the false Tala. It would hold for a while, but not long. Certainly not long enough to get them through what Karun's wing was about to inflict on them. The Magus stared at him, then smiled. He looked exactly like a crocodile. "Well done, Jouster Karun. I will commend your loyalty and zeal to serve to the Great Ones." Somewhere out there in the desert, he hoped, Calith was waiting. Whether they would all survive to reach him was another story. These were not fellow wingmates that they were about to harass. These were full-grown desert dragons, all wild-caught, and now, all of very uncertain temper, except, of course, for a single tame dragon that Karun especially did not want to face. What would the Magi think when none of the jousters returned, and they found a compound peopled only by slaves and servants? He hoped they would think that all of them had died,
and that Lord Kaman and Heclatus had deserted, rather than be held responsible for such a massive failure. He really, truly hoped that the Magi would send out trappers to take wild dragons and try the false Tala on them. That would be festive. Somewhere down there was a covered ox cart carrying an old peasant man and a quarrelsome old woman heading east. Hidden in the cart, beneath a false bottom, were a dozen images of Akkadian gods and goddesses, and one statue of a comely woman that was not a goddess, along with all the wealth that Lord Kaman and Heclatus could put together. Heclatus had looked disturbingly comfortable in that linen gown and woman's wig, but the statues ensured that the Magi might look for them, but they would not find them. They had all worn jousting armor and carried lances. The moment that they passed over the 7th Canal, the armor and lances had come falling out of the sky like a strange rain. No one was going to be encumbered today. No one was fighting today. The senior jousters were going to let the Tians chase them until their own dragons got too restive. Then they were going to take them down behind the Altan lines and let them go. That was the plan, anyway. No more need for jousting armor. There would be no more jousters. There might be dragon riders, but there would be no more jousters. Down there, so far below that they looked like ants, were the Tian and Altan armies, and there, coming from the south, were the Tian jousters. Up here it all seemed so very simple, and Kuran's mind felt strangely detached. Was this how the gods saw things, as tiny figures at a distance? It was impossible to tell individual warriors on the ground, and even the dragons were little more than scraps of color, swirling around each other, as if moved by the wind. If so, no wonder the gods failed to answer prayers. You couldn't see blood from up here. You couldn't see death or suffering. But I'm not a god, Kuran thought, taking in a sudden deep breath of air as the first of the little bits of color broke off and headed for the ground. And I may not see it, but I know it's there. It's time to do what I can to stop it. He gave Avatra the signal to dive. He didn't have to see his wing following his lead. He felt it. He didn't want Akhet 10 to be here, but he needed every dragon. And little Rieth-Ka was the smartest, the swiftest, the most agile of them all. And besides, he couldn't have kept Akhet 10 away short of knocking her out, stuffing her in a bag, and putting her in Lord Kaman's cart. And he knew very well what would happen to him then, if he made it to Sanctuary. Akhet 10 would finish what the Tian jousters started. He picked out a dragon, a big one, a blue and green, chasing an Altan brown swamp dragon. He gave Avatra the signal for a raking attack without the claws. The Tian never even knew he was coming. All he knew was that suddenly something big and red came up from behind, moving twice as fast as he was, and nearly knocked him out of his saddle with the buffeting wake of its passage. And his dragon, already giving him trouble, went mad. Kuran glanced back over his shoulder. The Tian had broken off the original chase and was now after him. There was another pair of Tians ahead of him, with just barely enough room between them to fit a third. He decided on the instant to fill that gap, and kept Avatra going straight ahead while she still had the momentum of her dive. She blew through the two of them. He glanced back. The purple blundered into the gold and green. Then the blue crashed into both of them. Angry screeches, the first he had ever heard from a dragon, followed him as he sent Avatra into a wing-over and headed her back up for more height. She rode her wings into the air, all business, ignoring the chaos she had left behind. He looked down. There were dull-colored dragons and a few bright ones flying free now. The dull ones were streaking back for the marshes of Alta, tearing bits of their harness off as they went. The bright ones seemed confused. He spotted another good target, a pair of Tian dragons going for the grounded Altan jousters, although their jousters seemed to be having some difficulty in getting them to go where they wanted. This time he didn't even have to give Avatra a signal. She seemed to sense where he was looking, as she had when they hunted in the desert together, and plunged downward toward the new target. This time she chose her own attack, the fisted one. Karun felt the thump as she hit something, though whether it was the dragon or the jouster, he could not have told for sure. She bounced back up. The dragon she hit blundered into the second, and that was 2 more Tians out of the melee. As she clawed for more height again, he took a look below. Now the Tian dragons in pursuit were chasing his wingmates, and even as he watched, he saw 2 of them break off, writhing and bucking in the air, deciding suddenly that the irritating nuisances on their backs were worse than the irritating nuisances that were harassing them. Avatra paused at the top of her climb, and suddenly Karun's vision was filled with a blue and gold dragon. Bleak eyes stared through him from within the slits of a jousting helmet. "I told you not to get on the other side of a joust from me!" Ari shouted, his voice hollow, his words filled with anger and pain, and he struck for Karun with his lance. But Avatra was faster, and she had been learning evasive moves from the moment Karun entered the Altan compound. She did a wing-over, and Ari's lance swished through the empty air. She turned the wing-over into a dive, heading for the ground this time. Karun did not have to look behind to know that Kashet was in hot pursuit. This was a mistake. Kashet was as good at ground-scorching dives as Avatra, and he had more practice. He touched Avatra with a signal. She responded instantly, flipping over in a side-slip tumble that put them upside down for an instant. Kashet shot past. Karun sent Avatra up and back in the opposite direction. It happened to be east. Time to run. He gave her the signal she wanted. For the second time in her life, Kashet pursued Avatra into the desert. This time the odds were better. She was stronger, bigger, and faster, with infinitely more endurance. He hadn't known that Ari was trying to help them the first time. He'd thought that the jouster, his master, was trying to catch them to bring them back to a mutual captivity. Now he didn't know what Ari wanted, but he knew what Ari's devotion to duty would make him try to do, and he didn't want to find out if friendship would win over duty. He leaned over Avatra's neck, making himself as small as possible, and then he gave her an entirely different signal. He dropped the reins. She was the best judge of what to do now. He would live or die by her instinct and ability. She responded at first only by deepening her wing beats and making her climb a little steeper. Then she turned her head, just a trifle, looked back over her own shoulder, and did a wing over to the left. Once again, Kashet shot past. This time, though, he fanned his wings furiously to break, and she shot past him as she turned her wing over into a shallow dive and continued on eastward. She had tricked him into dumping his speed. Karun's heart leaped. Kashet had never fought a dragon that was his equal before, but Avatra had been training with 8 other tame dragons. So he might have more jousting experience, but she knew how to trick another dragon. Karun longed to look back, but resisted the temptation. The battlefield was far behind them, but they were still not over the desert yet. Avatra turned her dive into a climb and glanced back. And ducked, spilling the wind from her wings. Kashet shot by overhead. "This isn't good. He's got more speed now and more height than we do." And 2 more dragons shot past, a blue-black and a silver-blue blur, and a purple-blue-scarlet beauty. Tathulan, who was nearly the size of Kashet, and Rieth-Ka, the largest and the smartest. Kashet was in the middle of a wing-over when Tathulan bowled past, using her own wake to send Kashet into a tumble. But the tumble sent Kashet where he wanted to go, straight into Avatra, and the great blue locked claws with her, and they began to plummet toward the earth, in an obscene echo of a mating fall. Karun screamed in terror, seeing his death rushing toward him. A blue, black, and silver thunderbolt struck both of them. Rieth-Ka had rammed them with chest and fisted foreclaws. Karun caught sight of Akhet-Ten's ashen face for a moment, then Rieth-Ka flapped away. But the blow had startled Kashet, so that he let go, and Avatra wrenched free. She snapped her wings open. With a jar that shook him to his teeth, she back-winged for a moment, then got control again and lumbered upward. Another indigo dragon scorched past her, Bethlin, cutting between Avatra and Kashet. Another, this time a red and sand streak that was Dioth. Cachette wasn't going to be distracted. Kurun could almost feel Cachette's hot breath on the back of his neck. He was going to close again. Avatra ducked and tumbled, and a pet ma, Say Atman, and Wastet slammed into Cachette from 3 sides in a copper, brown, and brilliant blue pinwheel. Kurun had often heard from old fighters that, at a moment of extreme crisis, time seems to slow. He had never believed that until this moment, when he saw Ari's body jounce upward in his saddle, saw the restraining straps snap with a sound like a whip crack, and watched Ari tumble down over Cachette's shoulder with the same graceful, languid motion as a petal dropping from a flower. His mouth opened. He thought he shouted. He knew he gave Avatra a signal she knew better than any other. She fought out of their tumble, stretched out her neck, made 1 desperate wing beat, a second, and on the third, got under Ari's falling body with that expert flip of her head and neck that tossed him sliding down the neck to lodge against the saddle, but not quite right. Ari slipped and slid off her right shoulder. Kurun screamed again and grabbed for Ari's arm as he fell for the second time. He caught it and was slammed against Avatra's neck by the sudden weight. She struggled for control. He howled with anguish as his arms seemed to flame with pain. He felt his fingers slipping, looked down into Ari's eyes, and saw bleak despair and resignation. Slowly, agonizingly, Kurun's grip slipped as Avatra lumbered sideways, pulled over by the weight. She didn't know what to do, and he couldn't tell her to land without letting go of Ari. The fingers slid down the forearm, wrist, gone. Just as Riethka slid right underneath, Ari landed across Riethka's shoulders, astride. He screamed in pain. Kurun didn't blame him. But at least while he was racked with pain, he wasn't fighting anyone. Akhet-Ten wrapped her arms around him and sent Riethka to the ground. Riethka was perfectly happy to go. The rest followed her down. Panting and weak with reaction, Kurun let Avatra drift in a slow spiral behind them. He didn't even think about Cachette. Until they landed beside Riethka and Akhet-Ten, who had Ari on the ground beside her, and the great blue and gold dragon powered out of the sky like a lightning bolt, heading straight for them. This time it was Avatra who interposed herself between Cachette and his prey, while Kurun howled, his voice cracking, "Cachette! No!" And Cachette stopped. A strange look came into the blue dragon's eyes, and his nostrils dilated as he sniffed in Kurun's direction. "Cachette," he said hoarsely, "you know me. We didn't mean to hurt him. We'll make him better." The dragon sniffed again and made a gurgling whine in the back of his throat. Kurun slid down off Avatra's shoulder. His knees were wobbly, but they held him. He stepped toward Cachette, holding out his hand. "Cachette," he said as calmly as he could. Remember Vetch?" Cachette lowered his head down and sniffed his palm, and sighed, then folded his legs underneath him with a groan and dropped into the sand. Sand? Kurun looked around. They had reached the edge of the desert, and he hadn't even noticed. He patted Avatra, who walked over to Cachette and sniffed him with deep suspicion, then stood guard over him. He trudged over to where the others were gathered around Ari. Well, all but Akhet-Ten. She was leaning against Riethka, just out of sight of the others, leaning against her dragon's shoulder. She looked white as fine linen, and he didn't feel much better. He knelt down next to Ari, who was clearly in pain. "Let me, young Kurun." The hand on his shoulder was attached to an arm clothed in Bedu blue. A moment later, the hand had gone to Ari's forehead, and the Bedu was whispering a few unfamiliar words, and the agony left Ari's face, but now the pain there was of a very different sort. He looked straight into Kurun's eyes.
Why didn't you let me die? He asked bitterly. And years ago, why didn't you let me? Karan replied without thinking. Because there has been enough of death on both sides, fools, the mouth of the Bedou said roughly. And enough of wallowing in self-pity. Get up, jouster, who is a jouster no more. And he grasped Ari's wrist and hauled him to his feet, turning him so that he faced into the west. Dozens of brightly colored dots were speeding overhead, coming toward them. One shot past directly overhead, and a little later a bit of harness fell out of the sky and hit Gan in the head. "Ow!" Gan shouted indignantly, and shook his fist at the retreating dragon. "We freed you, ungrateful wretch! Ingrate!" "There are no more jousters, Ari, rider of Cachet," said the Bedou. "Neither Tien nor Alten. There never will be again. You are freed of your oaths." Ari blinked. His lips twitched. "You, who speak for your gods, claim that?" "No," said Caliph, pushing his way between Aset Ra and Peatep. "I, who speak for the gods of both Tia and Alta, say that." This was not a Caliph that Karan had ever seen before. Leaner, browner, full of fire and energy, and with a look to his eyes as if he had seen all there was of pleasure and pain and had come to accept both as part of a greater whole. Now it was Karan's turn to blink. And all he could think was, if only Torath were here to see this, he would be so happy and so proud. For Caliph, who had always stood in his brother's shadow, had come into his own. Caliph had something else new. Around his neck was the hawk pectoral of a priest of Haras, and on both shoulders were tattoos of the symbol of the Winged Ones. "Priest?" said Ari falteringly. "And Winged One of Alta," replied Caliph. He took Ari's upper arm in a firm grasp. "And as both, I say to you, you are freed of your oaths, which had come to strangle you. There are no more jousters. The dragons will answer to no bond save love, and so you have no duty to return to. I give you the wings of the hawk to choose your fate. You may go anywhere you choose, and leave behind everything that has caused you such pain as made you ask, why did you not let me die? Or, asked Ari, looking into Caliph's eyes, or you may accept that pain, accept the burden of responsibility once again, and help us to do something that may bring a cure to the disease that rots both Tia and Alta. Caliph's gaze was steady. I promise nothing. The future is in flux, and my visions are not clear. But this I do pledge. Those who join us in sanctuary are vowed with one heart to the goal of ending this wretched war, and casting down those who fatten upon it. We have hands, we have plans, and we will try. Ari closed his eyes, and Karan held his breath. He felt as if he balanced on the edge of a knife blade. He didn't know why it was so important to have Ari with them, other than to himself, that is, but he sensed that it was, and so did Caliph. But Caliph was giving him the choice, to stay or to go, of his own will. Ari opened his eyes and looked straight at Karan, then past Karan, to where Avatra guarded an exhausted Cachet. And he smiled. Take me to this sanctuary of yours, he said. I should like to try. Epilogue. Sanctuary. Karan stood on the top of a squat, wind-eroded tower and looked down at the improvised pens where 10 dragons wallowed in sun-heated sand, as contented as ever dragons could be. The lost city was a very strange place. He had thought it would seem desolate and haunted by the ghosts of thousands. It actually seemed empty and waiting,
as if it never had held people before this moment. The buildings were familiar, yet unfamiliar, the shapes like those of Alta and Tia, yet unlike. Partly it was the utter lack of paintings, inscriptions, and carvings. There weren't even any statues of gods here. Partly it was the curves of the walls. There wasn't a straight line here anywhere. The dragons liked it, though. Perhaps it reminded them of the wind and water-cut valleys and caves where their kind made their homes. There was water here, the first need of life, an underground source that seemed bottomless. You reached it through the well house in the center of the sanctuary, which covered the stairway down, which in turn led to a cave and a huge spring-fed pool. Sanctuary itself provided the shelters, far more than the current population needed, although there were more people trickling in all the time. The first two had been Lord Kamun and Heclatus, the latter having shed his womanly disguise, but after them had come several of the dragon boys of Alta and Tia, including Bakken. Some of the healers of Alta and other folk, common and noble. One of those had been Lord Yatiran, who had doubled the population of Sanctuary by bringing with him his entire household. Akhet Ten and Orist could not have been more overjoyed. Kurun could not have been more relieved. Akhet Ten came up through the hole in the roof of the tower to stand beside him. He smiled at her, and made room for her to sit on the sand-scoured parapet. "Look," she said, pointing straight down below. Directly below was Cachette's pen. Entering it were Ari and Nofret. Their voices drifted up on the hot wind. "But of course there can be more dragons and more dragon riders," Nofret was saying, in a voice that sounded surprised. "It's not so difficult. How do we get young falcons? We take them from the nest, of course, and we can do the same with dragonettes. We have 10 dragons that can guard us while we take a single youngster, and we can ensure we do no harm by taking the ones that might not otherwise live, just as we do with falcons." "That never occurred to me," Ari replied, sounding surprised. "But, by Harris, you are right. We can set a watch on the dragon nests, take the ones that are not prospering, take the ones from parents that are not skilled." "And tell me, are there not times when the parents are slain, as happens with falcons?" Nofret asked. "Or injured, or killed by a disease? We can save those entire clutches, and of course, since they will have bonded first to their parents, they will eventually breed as well, and then we will have the best of both sorts of dragon, tame and wild." Her voice was alight with enthusiasm, as Kurun had never heard before, and Ari's, when he replied, was warm with pleasure. "How is it that you know so much about falcons?" he asked, "and care so much about dragons? I have, forgive me, my lady, but I admit my experience with women is rather limited. I never met a woman who thought about more than hair and gowns and jewels?" She laughed. "But I was a falconer, Ari. I helped tend and raise my father's birds. Payatep was my father's man, and I trained him. As for dragons, well, the first time I met Akhet Ten and saw her Riathka, my thought was not, 'That was Toreth's dragon.' It was, 'I want one like that.' I confess to you, I was raw with envy, and I would have traded every gown, wig, and gem in the world for a dragon of my own." Now I understand why you thought so much about how to gain more." Ari laughed, and his hand inched toward Nofret's. "Oh, I must also confess that my first flight was utterly terrifying," she said, a smile in her voice. "And for a little while, I thought perhaps this is not for me. But I managed to get beyond that fear as I watched Akhet Ten and Kurun flying away into the sky." And her hand inched toward his. And when they touched, their fingers curled around each other's, interlacing until they seemed that they had never been apart. "I believe, my lady," said Ari softly, "that we must needs find you a dragonet of your own. I should not like to find you trying to win my Cachette away from me. And
I would like to show you what the world looks like from above. It is strange. There are no borders, you see.
Karun found himself smiling, then grinning, and had to swallow to keep from whooping aloud as Nofret leaned her head on Ari's shoulder.
I should like that, Ari. And please call me Nofret. There are no ladies here.
With a start, Karun realized that his fingers had somehow gotten entwined with Akhet Ten's.
I think we should give them some privacy, don't you?
He whispered, hoping she could not hear how his heart pounded.
That might be a good idea,
she whispered back with a grin.
And you know, we might want to go see if there are dragon nesting places around here. It's going to be a while before Sanctuary can do anything about the Magi and the war. And we're going to need more dragon riders when we do.
We certainly will, he replied warmly, basking in their shared dream. Perhaps he was no winged one, but the vision was clear to both of them.
We certainly will.
This concludes Alta by Mercedes Lackey, narrated by Ryan Burke. Copyright 2004 by Mercedes R. Lackey. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with Mercedes Lackey, care of Scoville Galen Gauche Literary Agency, Incorporated, and was produced in the year 2019 by Tantor Media, Incorporated, a division of Recorded Books, which holds the copyright thereto. Please visit tantor.com for more information on our growing library of unabridged audiobooks.